At 64 years old, Martha Sterling pulled her sedan onto the narrow coastal road toward a property she believed had been empty for 6 months. But what her husband Richard didn't know was that his careful schedule of business trips had finally overlapped with Martha's need for the truth. This is the story of how a woman who gave everything for 35 years found her life sitting in a house she didn't know was occupied. If you've ever felt like a ghost in your own home, if you've spent decades building a foundation for someone else only to watch them walk away, or if you've ever discovered that your sacrifices were the fuel for another person's secret life, this story is for you. Subscribe now and stay with us until the end. What Martha saw through the window of that stone cottage will change the way you look at loyalty forever. The road to the estuary was a ribbon of grey asphalt between high hedges. Martha gripped the steering wheel. Her knuckles were white. She reached up with one hand to touch the silver locket resting against her collarbone. The metal was cold. The hinge was loose and rattled when her fingers brushed it. Inside the locket was a tiny slip of paper from their wedding day. She had not looked at it in 20 years. She didn't need to. She remembered the words he had written. He had promised she would always have a home with him. For 35 years, Martha had been the quiet engine of Richard's accounting firm. She was the bookkeeper who sat in the windowless office at the back of the building. She worked 10 hours a day without a salary. In 1994, she had stayed at her desk until midnight for 3 weeks. She was balancing the books for an audit, while Richard took the partners on a fishing trip to celebrate their growth. She didn't complain. In 2008, when the market crashed and the firm nearly folded, Martha had sold her mother's antique mahogany dining set. She used the cash to cover the office rent for 4 months. She told Richard it was a gift. She ate her dinner on a card table for a year after that. He never offered to replace the set. He told her the card table was more efficient for a woman of her practical nature. She believed him. The silver locket clicked against her chest as the car hit a pothole. Martha had bought her own winter coat at a thrift store for the last 3 years. She told Richard she liked the vintage style. The truth was that the firm's insurance premiums had doubled. She wanted to make sure Richard could afford the lease on his new luxury SUV. He needed the car to impress clients. He told her a man in his position had an image to maintain. Martha maintained the ledgers instead. She knew every cent that came in. She knew every cent that went out. But she didn't know about the estuary house. Richard called it the money pit. He said it was a rental property he had inherited from a distant aunt. He told Martha it was a disaster of leaking pipes and dry rot. He said the tenants were always behind on rent. He said he had to visit it twice a month just to keep the roof from falling in. The cottage came into view as the road turned toward the water. It was a small stone building with a slate roof. The stones were a warm gold in the afternoon light. The grass was neatly trimmed. There were blue shutters on the windows. A child's bicycle lay on its side near the front porch. Martha slowed the car. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Richard had told her the house was uninhabitable. He had told her it was a drain on their retirement savings. She pulled the car to the edge of the gravel. She did not turn off the engine. She stared at the front window. A yellow lamp was glowing inside the living room. She recognized the lamp. It was the brass floor lamp that had gone missing from their attic 2 years ago. Richard told her he had donated it to a charity drive. Martha stepped out of the car. The air smelled of salt and damp earth. She walked toward the window. She moved slowly. The gravel crunched under her sensible leather shoes. She reached the glass and looked inside. The room was warm. There was a rug on the floor that matched the one in her own bedroom. In the corner sat a large velvet armchair. It was a deep forest green. Martha had spent 4 months' worth of grocery money to have that chair upholstered 10 years ago. She had chosen the fabric herself. Richard told her the chair was too bulky for their new minimalist living room. He told her he had sent it to a storage unit. Now, a small boy was curled up in the green velvet. He was reading a book. He looked about 6 years old. He had Richard's dark hair. He had Richard's narrow nose. A woman walked into the frame. She was young. She was wearing a silk robe Martha had never seen before. The woman leaned down and kissed the boy on the forehead. She looked toward the door. She looked like she was waiting for someone to come home. Martha felt a sharp pain in her lower back. She felt the weight of 35 years of unpaid bookkeeping. She felt the weight of the sold dining set. She felt the weight of the thrift store coat. The locket felt heavy. She reached up and felt the broken hinge. She didn't move. She stood in the garden of the house that was supposed to be a ruin. The boy in the chair turned a page. Martha realized she wasn't looking at a rental property. She was looking at the life Richard had built with the money she had saved for him. She was the shadow. This was the reality. She stayed there for a long time. She didn't cry. She watched the woman set a third plate at the small kitchen table. Martha Sterling, 64 years old, had learned to measure time in fiscal quarters rather than seasons. She had spent 35 years as the invisible architecture of Richard's success. When they first started the firm, the office was a single room above a noisy laundromat. Martha had worked the reception desk and the billing department and the janitorial shift. She remembered the smell of industrial detergent rising through the floorboards while she balanced accounts. She didn't have a desk of her own back then. She used the top of a metal filing cabinet as a workspace for 3 years. Richard told her that every dollar saved on furniture was a dollar invested in their future. She believed him because he looked her in the eye when he said it. He always looked people in the eye. By the time the firm moved to the glass tower downtown, Martha was still at the back. She handled the difficult clients who shouted about their tax returns. She smoothed over the errors Richard made when he was too busy networking at the golf club. In 2012, Richard had a mild heart scare that kept him in bed for a month. Martha ran the entire firm from a laptop perched on his bedside table. She slept in a chair next to him so she could hear his breathing. She processed 300 payroll checks while he slept. When he recovered, he took a 2-week solo trip to the mountains to find his focus. He told her she deserved a rest too. He suggested she spend the weekend cleaning out the attic to clear her mind. She spent the weekend in the dust and the heat. She found the old green velvet chair that weekend. She decided to keep it. The silver locket at her neck was the only piece of jewelry she wore every day. Richard had given it to her on the morning of their wedding. The silver was thin, and the chain was delicate. He told her it was an heirloom from his grandmother. Later, Martha found a receipt in an old coat pocket from a department store. The locket had cost $29 on clearance. She never mentioned the receipt to him. She folded the receipt into a tiny square and tucked it inside the locket. She told herself that the price didn't matter as much as the gesture. She had lived her entire life on the strength of small gestures. She had ignored the gaps in his stories for 30 years. She had ignored the late-night phone calls from unlisted clients. She had ignored the way he checked his watch during their anniversary dinners. A woman who spends 30 years looking at numbers learns how to make them fit. She had simply made the numbers of her life fit his narrative. Richard had first mentioned the Estuary house 10 years ago. He called it a burden. He said his Aunt Beatrice had left him a nightmare of a property. He told Martha that the taxes were higher than the rental income. He said the foundation was sinking into the salt marsh. Every few months, he would come home looking exhausted. He would tell her he had spent the day dealing with a burst pipe or a broken heater. He said the house was a black hole for their savings. Martha offered to go with him to help paint or garden. Richard always refused. He told her the mold in the cellar would trigger her allergies. He said he couldn't live with himself if she got sick because of his family's mess. He called her his delicate flower while she hauled boxes of files up 3 flights of stairs. She thought he was protecting her. She thought his secret trips to the coast were a sacrifice he made for her peace of mind. The locket felt heavy as she stood by the car. She looked at the garden of the Estuary house again. The blue shutters were not peeling. The foundation was not sinking. The windows were clean and expensive. There was no smell of mold in the air. The air smelled of lavender and expensive wood smoke. Martha realized that every dollar she had saved by buying thrift store coats had gone here. Every hour she had worked without a salary had paid for that child's bicycle. Every night she had spent balancing the books had bought that woman's silk robe. She touched the loose hinge of the locket. The tiny square of paper inside felt like a stone. She was 64 years old, and she was standing on the lawn of her own life. But someone else was living in it. She walked back to the driver's side door. She didn't make a sound. The boy in the green velvet chair didn't look up. The woman in the kitchen didn't see the shadow on the grass. Martha got into the car and closed the door softly. She didn't start the engine right away. She sat in the silence and watched the yellow light in the window. She thought about the card table in her dining room. She thought about the filing cabinet she had used as a desk. She thought about the 300 payroll checks. The numbers finally stopped fitting. The math was simple now. She had been the investment. This house was the profit. She turned the key in the ignition. Martha Sterling sat in the kitchen of the home she had maintained for 3 decades. She was 64 years old. She had not turned on the overhead light. The refrigerator hummed in the corner. It was a sound she had lived with for 10 years. Richard came through the back door at 10 minutes past 7. He smelled of expensive cologne and the salt air of the estuary. He looked at her with a small, tired smile. "Still in the dark, Martha?" he asked. He walked to the counter and set down a brown paper bag. "I brought you those crackers you like," he said. "I'm worried about your health. You haven't been eating enough." He didn't wait for a response. He began to untie his silk tie. It was a deep burgundy. Martha had bought it for him last Christmas. She had skipped her own dental appointment to afford the silk. Richard walked toward the hallway. He stopped and looked at her coat hanging on the back of the chair. "You really need to throw that thing away," he said. "It makes you look like a pauper. It's embarrassing for the firm." He said it casually. He said it the way a person might comment on the weather. Martha felt the silver locket click against her skin. "I saw the green chair today, Richard," she said. The room went very still. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to grow louder. Richard did not turn around. He smoothed the fabric of his tie over his hand. He adjusted his cufflink. He checked his watch and tapped the glass. "I was wondering when you'd take a drive out there," he said. His voice was flat. It was the same voice he used to explain a tax deduction. "I suppose you saw the boy as well." He turned then. He looked concerned. He walked to the card table and sat down across from her. "Martha, look at me," he said. "I'm just being realistic. You're 64 years old. The firm is moving in a different direction. You've worked so hard for so long. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're just being practical." He reached into his leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick blue folder. He set it on the card table. "This is what's best for everyone," he said. "You'll be so much more comfortable in the country." He leaned over the table. He didn't look at her eyes. He looked at the folder. 10 years is a long time to keep a secret, Martha. But I did it to protect you. I wanted to make sure you had a place to go when I transitioned the business. You should have planned better for your own future." He opened the folder and pointed to a line at the bottom. "Sign here," he said. "It's a clean break. This is fair." Martha looked at the paper. She looked at his hands. They were clean and soft. They were not the hands of a man who repaired leaking pipes. They were not the hands of a man who fought dry rot. She thought about the 35 years of ledgers. She thought about the filing cabinet desk. She thought about the card table where she ate her dinner. The silver locket felt like a lead weight. "The boy has my nose," Martha said quietly. Richard didn't flinch. "He has my drive too," he said, "which is why the firm needs to be his one day. You understand, don't you? 4 years is a long time to string someone along, even if she was essentially just the help." He stood up and walked toward the mirror in the hallway. He began to fix his hair. He looked satisfied. He looked like a man who had successfully closed a difficult deal, the accounting firm to the junior partners, the city house to the woman in the silk robe, the investment accounts to the boy with his nose. While he checked the time on his gold watch and smoothed his hair in the mirror, Martha received what he called the gift of peace, the deed to a decommissioned stone chapel on a tidal marsh, and $42.12 in her checking account. "I'll have someone come for my things tomorrow," Richard said. He picked up his briefcase. "The chapel is yours. It's what you always said you wanted, peace and quiet." He walked toward the door. "Don't forget the crackers," he said. "They're the low-sodium ones." He didn't look back. He didn't say goodbye. He stepped out into the night, and the door clicked shut. Martha sat in the dark. She was 64 years old, and she had $42. The silver locket felt cold against her chest. She reached out and touched the blue folder. The paper felt like ice. She looked at the card table. She looked at the empty kitchen. She thought about the boy in her green chair. She thought about the woman in the silk robe. She stood up and walked to the closet. She put on her thrift store coat. She felt the tiny slip of paper inside her locket. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She knew what a promise looked like when it was broken. She walked to the refrigerator and took the bag of crackers. She threw them in the trash. The room was silent now. The hum of the refrigerator had stopped. Martha Sterling sat at the card table for 3 hours. The house was perfectly still. She looked at her phone on the plastic tabletop. The black screen reflected the ceiling light. She waited for it to glow. She waited for a text from her sister in Ohio. She waited for a call from the office manager. The phone stayed dark. She picked it up and checked the signal. The bars were full. Nobody was calling. Richard had already spoken to everyone who mattered. He had framed the narrative before she could even breathe. He had told them she was tired. He had told them she was unraveling. In his version of the story, he was the hero, providing her a quiet place to rest. She opened her banking app with a steady hand. She had managed millions of dollars for 35 years. She knew how to read a balance sheet. The screen showed her personal account. It contained $42.12. The savings account she had shared with Richard was gone. Her name had been scrubbed from the digital record. She went to the history tab. A transfer of $60,000 had occurred at 4 in the afternoon. It was the exact amount she had saved from her inheritance 5 years ago. He had moved it to a trust she couldn't touch. She was 64 years old and she had the price of a tank of gas and a bag of groceries. She stood up and walked to the hallway closet. She took her heavy boots. She took a flashlight and a set of spare batteries. She went to the bedroom and opened her jewelry box. It was mostly empty. She had sold the good pieces to pay for the office renovations in 2006. She took a pair of pearl earrings her mother had given her. She put them in her pocket. Then she reached for the silver locket at her neck. The hinge felt loose under her fingertip. She squeezed the metal until it hurt. This was the second time she had felt this particular weight. The first was the day she realized Richard was lying about the audit. She had stayed then. She wouldn't stay now. She packed her suitcase in the dark. She didn't turn on the bedroom lights. She didn't want to see the empty space on Richard's side of the bed. She packed a thick wool sweater and her oldest denim jeans. She packed a box of tea and a tin of butter cookies. She found a heavy wrench in the kitchen drawer and put it in her bag. She didn't know what she would find at the chapel. Richard had described it as a ruin. He had called it a burden. She took a heavy blanket from the sofa. She walked out to the garage. Her sedan was 10 years old. The trunk clicked shut. She sat in the driver's seat. The dashboard lights were a cold blue. She looked at the gas gauge. It was half full. She had exactly $42.12. The drive to the estuary was 140 miles. She put the car in reverse. She didn't look at the house in the mirror. She didn't think about the mahogany table or the green chair. She thought about the stone chapel. She thought about the salt air. She turned the steering wheel and headed for the highway. The streetlights blurred into long streaks of white. She didn't look back. The rain began 40 miles from the coast. It was a thin, freezing mist that coated the windshield in a layer of grey. Martha Sterling, 64 years old, gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. The highway turned into a 2-lane road that wound through thickets of pine and scrub oak. The trees leaned over the asphalt like old men watching her pass. She reached the town of Oakhaven just after midnight. The town was silent. She saw a gas station with 2 rusted pumps sitting under a flickering fluorescent light. A sign above the door said General Store in faded red letters. The awning was torn and flapped rhythmically in the wind. Martha pulled the car to a stop near the edge of the gravel. She needed a map. The blue folder Richard had given her contained an address written in his sharp, aggressive handwriting. But the GPS on her phone had stopped working 10 miles ago. She stepped out of the car. The cold air hit her lungs like a physical blow. Inside the store, a man sat behind a counter made of dark, polished wood. He wore a flannel shirt and a cap with a faded fish logo. The room smelled of coffee and old grease and wood smoke. There were checkered curtains in the small window facing the road. They were stained yellow from decades of dust. The man looked up from a newspaper as the bell above the door chimed. He didn't look surprised to see a woman in a worn thrift store coat at midnight. "You're Martha," he said. He didn't ask. He stated it as a fact. Martha froze with her hand still on her purse. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The man stood up. His knees creaked loudly in the quiet room. "Richard's wife," he said. "We've been waiting for you to show up for a long time." He walked to a shelf behind the counter and pulled down a heavy iron lantern. "He told us you'd come eventually after he passed," the man continued. "He didn't tell us he was still breathing when you finally left." He set the lantern on the counter. "I'm Silas," he said. "The chapel is 3 miles down the estuary road. Take the lantern. The wiring in that place hasn't worked since the storm of '88. Martha took the lantern. Her hands were shaking so violently, she had to use both of them. She didn't ask how he knew her name. She didn't ask what Richard had told the people in this town. She walked back to her car and felt the weight of the silver locket against her chest. The mist had turned into a steady, driving downpour. She followed the estuary road as it hugged the shoreline. The water was a black sheet on her left. The reeds hissed in the wind. She saw the stone structure rising out of the tall grass. It was worse than the photo Richard had shown her. The chapel was built of rough, grey granite. The stone structure looked black in the rain. Ivy had climbed the walls and choked the narrow, arched windows. The roof was a jagged line of missing slates and exposed timber. The bell tower was a hollow tooth against the midnight sky. It didn't look like a home. It looked like a tomb for something long forgotten. Martha stopped the car and left the headlights on. The lights caught the front door. The wood was dark and swollen with rot. A heavy iron padlock hung from a rusted latch. She thought about the $42.12 in her checking account. She thought about the 6-year-old boy sitting in her green chair. She reached for the gear shift to put the car in reverse. She was 64 years old. She could not fix a ruin. She could not live in a place where the wind moved through the walls. Then she saw it. At the very top of the stone doorframe was a small carving. It was a single ivy leaf. The stone was worn by a century of salt air, but the detail was still there. It was the exact pattern engraved on the back of her silver locket. She reached up and touched the locket. The loose hinge rattled under her thumb. She remembered her grandmother's voice from a summer 40 years ago. "Find the leaf, Martha." She had forgotten her grandmother even owned property on this coast. Richard had told her he inherited it from his aunt. The lie was so large it made her ears ring. This wasn't his property to give away. This was her inheritance. He hadn't given her a gift. He had given her back a piece of her own life while pretending it was charity. She stepped out into the mud. The rain soaked through her coat in seconds. She walked to the door and took the rusty iron key from the blue folder. Her fingers were blue with the cold. She slid the key into the lock. The metal groaned as she turned it. She leaned her shoulder against the wood and pushed. The door didn't move. She pushed again, with everything she had left in her body. The wood shrieked. The door swung inward into total darkness. The air that rushed out smelled of ancient dust and dry grass. Martha stepped over the threshold. The door clicked shut behind her. Martha Sterling woke on the stone floor of the chapel as the first grey light touched the ivy-choked windows. She was 64 years old. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, heavy pulse that made it difficult to stand. Her knees clicked like dry twigs when she finally forced herself upright. The air inside the chapel was colder than the air outside. It smelled of wet dust and the particular metallic scent of old, damp stone. She looked at her phone. The screen was a blank black mirror. There were no missed calls. There were no text messages from the friends she had known for 30 years. The silence of the device was a physical weight in the center of the room. She walked to the arched doorway and looked at the interior. The roof over the altar had collapsed years ago. A pile of rotted timber and shattered slate lay in a heap on the flagstones. Rainwater had pooled in the depressions of the floor. She thought, "I cannot fix a leaky roof. I am 64 years old with $42.12, and I cannot fix a leaky roof." The math beyond that was too large to look at directly. She sat on an overturned wooden bench and stared at the debris. This was the moment she considered stopping. She thought about driving back to the city and sitting on the sidewalk in front of Richard's office. She thought about making him look at her. But then she saw the blue tarp. It was tangled in the fallen rafters near the back wall. It was thick and heavy and covered in a decade of pine needles. Martha stood up. She dragged the tarp across the floor. Her shoulders burned with the effort. She found a coil of rusted wire in a corner cupboard. She used the heavy wrench from her suitcase to twist the wire into hooks. She climbed a narrow stone staircase to the choir loft. She ignored the shaking in her thighs. She hooked the tarp over the exposed beams. It wasn't a repair. It was a shield. When the next gust of wind hit the chapel, the tarp held. The sound was a sharp, defiant snap. A man appeared in the doorway an hour later. He was tall and wore a heavy wool coat, the color of the sea. He carried a thermos and a small wooden toolbox. "Silas said you'd be here," he said. His voice was deep and slow. "I'm Elias. I live in the cottage across the marsh." He didn't wait for her to invite him in. He walked to the center of the room and looked at her blue tarp. "Good knots," he said. He set the thermos on the bench. "My wife used to say the stone here remembers who belongs to it." He didn't ask Martha why she was there. He didn't ask where her husband was. He opened his toolbox and took out a steel chisel. Martha watched him work on a jammed window frame. "Richard told everyone this place was a ruin," she said. Elias didn't look up from the wood. "Richard has a habit of calling things worthless when he can't control them," he replied. He stepped back and tapped the frame. The window swung open, for the first time in 30 years. A hawk circled over the estuary outside. Martha felt a strange, cold spark of energy in her chest. She picked up a broom she had found in the vestry. She began to sweep the salt and the dust toward the door. She established a rhythm. Sweep, step, sweep. By noon, a small square of the floor was clean. By evening, the debris was piled in the corner. She sat on the bench and drank the coffee Elias had left. She looked at her hands. The skin was red and the knuckles were swollen. But they were her hands. They were not typing Richard's letters. They were not balancing Richard's fraud. She looked at the silver locket sitting on the bench beside her. The ivy leaf carving on the stone doorway seemed to glow in the twilight. She thought about the $42. It was enough for bread and milk and a tin of kerosene. She wasn't dying in this chapel. She wasn't dying because a man decided she was a footnote. She was 64 years old and she was still here. The hawk screamed once over the water. The rain returned on the third night. Water began to seep through the floorboards near the altar. Martha followed the sound of the drip down the narrow stairs to the small cellar. The air was thick with the smell of wet lime and iron. She carried Silas's lantern in her left hand. She used the heavy wrench in her right to probe the damp stones of the foundation. The floor of the cellar was covered in an inch of silt. She stepped carefully to avoid the deeper puddles. Her lower back felt like a hot wire was being drawn through her spine. She did not stop. She reached a corner where the water was bubbling from behind a large granite block. The block was carved with a faint border of ivy leaves. Martha leaned in closer. She reached up to wipe the condensation from her glasses. As she moved, the silver locket at her neck swung forward. The broken hinge caught in a narrow crack between the stones. She pulled back instinctively. The chain tightened against her throat. The locket did not come free. She set the lantern on a dry ledge. She used her fingers to clear the moss and grit from the crack. The stone was not settled like the others. It shifted under her touch. She gripped the edges of the granite block. She pulled. The stone moved 2 inches. Dust and small pebbles fell onto her boots. She braced her feet in the silt and pulled again. The block slid out of the wall and hit the floor with a dull thud. Behind it was a hollow space. Martha reached into the darkness. Her fingers brushed cold metal. She pulled out a small iron box with a heavy brass latch. The box was dry. It had been wrapped in a thick layer of waxed canvas. She carried the box to the light of the lantern. Her hands were trembling. She struggled with the latch for a minute before it snapped open. Inside were 2 thick envelopes and a leather-bound ledger. The paper was yellow but crisp. She opened the first envelope. She read the first line. Then she read it again. Her breath hitched in her chest. The letter was dated August 12th, 1988. It was written in the precise, elegant hand of Richard's father. But it was not addressed to Richard. It was addressed to Martha's grandmother. "I am placing the Estuary Trust in Martha's name," the letter began. "Richard has shown a weakness for easy money that concerns me." Martha sat down on the bottom step of the cellar. The cold of the stone seeped through her jeans. She did not feel it. She opened the second envelope. It was a deed of trust. It listed the stone chapel and 40 acres of the surrounding marsh. It listed a separate investment account at a bank in London. The beneficiary was Martha Sterling. There was no mention of Richard. There was no mention of an Aunt Beatrice. The documents proved that the ruin Richard had given her as charity was already hers. He had been acting as the trustee for a fund he had hidden from her for 30 years. He had been using the interest from her own inheritance to pay for the house in the city. He had been using her money to buy the silk robes for the other woman. Martha looked at the ledger. It recorded every payment made from the trust since 1989. The numbers were all there. She saw the $60,000 withdrawal from 4 days ago. She saw the monthly payments to a property management firm she did not recognize. The firm was the one that owned the house where the boy lived. Martha spoke aloud to the empty cellar. "You stole it," she whispered. The words echoed against the damp granite. "You stole my life with my own money." She touched the silver locket. The tiny slip of paper inside was not a promise of a home. It was a receipt for a 30-year lie. She sat in the silence for a long time. The lantern flickered. She looked at the signature on the deed. It was her own name. She was not a pauper with $42. She was the owner of the ground she stood on. She closed the iron box. The truth was heavier than the stone. Martha Sterling, 64 years old, did not wait for the bank in London to answer her letters. She spent her remaining $42.12 on 3 gallons of white vinegar, a stiff wire brush, and a box of heavy-duty trash bags. The work began at dawn the next morning. She spent the first 3 days on her knees. The flagstones were covered in a thick crust of salt and dried mud. She poured the vinegar directly onto the stone. The liquid hissed as it hit the grit. She gripped the wire brush with both hands and scrubbed. She scrubbed until the muscles in her shoulders burned. She scrubbed until her palms were raw and red. By the 4th day, the grey granite began to show its true color. It was a soft, pale silver that caught the morning light. She moved to the walls next. The ivy had grown deep into the mortar over the decades. She used her heavy wrench to pry the thickest vines away from the stone. The wood of the vines was tough and stringy. She pulled until her breath came in ragged gasps. She felt the strain in her lower back as a sharp, biting pain. She sat on the floor and waited for the pulse in her spine to fade. Then she stood back up. She cleared the debris into the trash bags. She hauled the bags to the edge of the road one by one. Her thrift store coat was stained with green sap and grey dust. She did not look at the stains. She only looked at the stone. Elias arrived on the 6th day with a wooden ladder lashed to his truck. He didn't say a word as he set it against the bell tower. He climbed up and began to replace the shattered slates. Martha watched him from the ground. "I can't pay you yet," she said. Elias looked down from the roof. "I'm not doing it for you," he said. "I'm doing it because a building like this shouldn't have to hold its breath anymore." He stayed until the sun went down. He brought a power sander the next morning. He showed Martha how to use it on the oak benches. The loud whine of the machine filled the chapel. The dust tasted like old forests and salt. Martha spent 4 days sanding the wood. She moved the machine in long, steady strokes. She watched the grey, weathered surface disappear. Beneath the age was a rich, dark grain. She rubbed linseed oil into the wood with a scrap of an old towel. The oak drank the oil hungrily. The benches began to glow with a deep, honey-colored light. She cleaned the narrow, arched windows last. She used a mixture of water and wood ash she had gathered from the hearth. She worked slowly. She didn't want to crack the thin, ancient glass. The dirt came off in thick, black streaks. The transformation was not a sudden miracle. It was a series of small, painful victories. It was the sound of the front door swinging without a creak. It was the smell of the linseed oil replacing the scent of rot. It was the way the floor stayed dry after a morning mist. Martha looked at her hands. They were covered in fine wood dust. The skin was calloused and hard. She reached up to adjust the silver locket. The ivy leaf carving on the stone doorframe was finally clean. It matched the pattern on the locket perfectly. The beauty of the room changed at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun dipped low over the estuary. The light came through the west window in a single, concentrated beam. It hit a small patch of stained glass near the top of the arch. Martha hadn't noticed the color before. It was a deep, brilliant violet. The beam of light traveled across the silver granite floor. It turned the dust motes in the air into a swarm of golden sparks. The entire room seemed to vibrate with the color. The chapel was no longer a tomb. It was a vessel for the light. Martha stood in the center of the golden band. She was 64 years old. She was covered in dust and sweat. She took a deep breath of the clean, oiled air. She belonged here. Martha Sterling, 64 years old, stopped charging her phone on the 10th day. She watched the screen flicker and go dark. She did not reach for the charging cable. She placed the dead device inside the iron box in the cellar. She set it on top of the documents that proved her husband was a thief. For 35 years, she had lived by the vibration of that phone. She had answered every call from Richard within 2 rings. She had responded to every urgent text about a missing file or a late dinner. Now, the silence in the chapel was a choice. She walked to the altar and sat on the newly oiled oak bench. She did not look at the door to see if a luxury SUV was turning into the drive. She looked at the light on the silver granite floor. She spoke to the empty room for the first time that evening. "You knew he would try to take it, didn't you, Arthur?" She was speaking to Richard's father. She thought about the man who had written those letters in 1988. She remembered him as a stern man with a quiet voice. He had watched her work 10-hour days while Richard went to the club. He had seen her sell her mother's dining set to save the firm. He had never thanked her in person, but he had built a stone vault for her in the marsh. "You knew I would eventually need a place where his name didn't matter," Martha whispered. She felt a cold, steady peace settle into her bones. It was not the peace of a delicate flower in a garden. It was the peace of the stone itself. The community began to arrive on the 12th day. They did not come with casseroles or pity. Silas from the general store was the first. He arrived in a rusted truck filled with salt-resistant rose bushes. "These belong to your grandmother," he said. He didn't wait for her to help him unload. She had a hedge of them along the north wall. Richard told us they died of blight years ago, but he just stopped watering them. Silas spent the afternoon digging in the rocky soil. Martha worked beside him. Her hands were covered in black earth. She didn't worry about her fingernails or her thrift store coat. She felt the strength in her forearms as she packed the dirt. A woman named Clara arrived 2 days later. She carried a basket of sourdough bread and a jar of local honey. "My mother went to school with your mother in this chapel," Clara said. She sat on the bench and watched the light move across the violet glass. "We used to hear the bell every Sunday morning." Richard told the council the bell was cracked and dangerous. He had the rope removed 5 years ago. Clara stayed for 3 hours. She told Martha stories about the estuary that Richard had never mentioned. She told her about the tidal shifts and the hidden oyster beds. She spoke to Martha as if they had known each other for decades. Martha realized that these people had been waiting for a sterling to return, but they hadn't been waiting for Richard. By the end of the week, the chapel was no longer a secret. A young man from the docks brought a coil of new hemp rope. He climbed the bell tower without being asked. A retired teacher brought a box of hymnals from the 1920s. She helped Martha arrange them on the sanded oak benches. The visitors didn't treat Martha like a victim of a divorce. They treated her like the owner of a landmark. Martha stopped defining herself by the office at the back of the building. She stopped thinking of herself as essentially just the help. When she looked in the small mirror in the vestry, she saw a woman with sun-reddened skin. She saw a woman with hard, capable hands. She saw a woman who had built a home out of $42 and a stolen legacy. She sat on the porch as the sun went down. Elias walked over from the marsh with a small wooden crate. "Found these in my shed," he said. He opened the crate to reveal a set of heavy brass candle holders. "They belong on that altar," he said. "They've been sitting in the dark long enough." Martha took one of the holders. The brass was heavy and cool. "Thank you, Elias," she said. Elias looked out at the water. "Don't thank me, Martha. The building is just standing up straight again. It's hard not to notice when someone finally decides to breathe." Martha looked at the ivy leaf carving above her head. She didn't feel like a shadow anymore. She felt like the granite. The luxury SUV turned into the gravel drive of the Estuary Chapel at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday. Martha Sterling, 64 years old, was on a ladder near the bell tower. She was wearing her thrift store coat and a pair of heavy work gloves. She didn't stop her work when she heard the engine. She continued to scrub the moss from the stone arch. She didn't look down as the door of the SUV clicked shut. Richard walked toward the chapel. The gravel crunched under his Italian leather loafers. He was wearing a light grey suit that cost more than Martha had spent on food in the last 5 years. He stopped 10 feet from the ladder and looked up. "Martha," he said. His voice was smooth and practiced. "I've been worried about you. Silas told me you were living here like a squatter." Martha climbed down the ladder. Her knees ached with a dull, familiar heat. She stood on the silver granite floor she had scrubbed by hand. She pulled off her gloves and looked at him. Richard didn't look at her eyes. He looked at the sanded oak benches. He looked at the violet light coming through the clean glass. "This is better than I expected," he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small gold pen. "But we have to be realistic, Martha. A woman your age can't manage 40 acres of marsh. The upkeep alone will bankrupt you." He walked to the altar and touched the wood. "I've brought the final release forms. I've found a developer who wants the stone for a new project in the city. We can sell the land and get you into a beautiful assisted living suite, one with a garden you don't have to weed." He set a blue folder on the altar. "It's a clean break, Martha. This is fair. I'm doing this because I'm concerned about your health. You look exhausted. You should have planned better for your later years." He smiled at her. It was the same smile he used when he told the firm's partners that Martha was taking a well-deserved rest. Martha felt the silver locket heavy against her chest. "I found the iron box, Richard," she said. The smile on Richard's face didn't move. It simply froze. The silence in the chapel was absolute. A hawk screamed once over the estuary. Richard adjusted his cufflink. He looked at the floor. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. His voice had lost its smooth edge. "My father was an old man, Martha." He was confused toward the end. He didn't understand the complexities of modern trust law. He walked toward her. He tried to put a hand on her shoulder. "I was just protecting the assets. I was protecting you from yourself. You're not getting nothing. You're getting a property." He gestured to the stone walls. "Even if it was technically in your name, I'm the one who maintained the records. I'm the one who kept it from falling into the sea." Martha stepped back. She did not scream. She did not cry. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the leather-bound ledger. "You didn't protect me, Richard. You stole 35 years of my labor. You stole my inheritance to pay for a life with a woman who wears silk robes in my house. You used my father-in-law's trust to buy a bicycle for a boy who has my nose but none of my name." She opened the ledger to the last page. "The bank in London has already frozen the accounts. The attorney in Oakhaven has the original deed." Richard's face turned a deep, mottled red. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the woman in the thrift store coat. He didn't recognize her. He had spent 35 years looking at a shadow. "You can't prove anything," he hissed. His voice was no longer caring. "I built that firm. I am the sterling name in this state." Martha looked at the ivy leaf carving above his head. "The name on the deed is Martha," she said. "The name on the trust is Martha. You are a guest on my property, Richard, and you are no longer invited." She pointed toward the door. Richard grabbed the blue folder from the altar. His hands were shaking so hard the papers rattled. "You'll die out here alone," he said. "You're 64 years old and you have no one. No one in the city will even take your call." Martha walked to the bell tower rope. "I'm not in the city," she said. She pulled the rope. The sound of the bell was deep and clear. It echoed across the marsh. It echoed through the town of Oakhaven. Richard looked at the door. Silas and Elias were standing in the gravel drive. They were not moving. They were just watching. Richard looked back at Martha. He looked small in his grey suit. He looked like a man who had finally run out of numbers to move. He walked out of the chapel. He didn't look at Silas or Elias as he got into his SUV. The gravel sprayed as he backed out of the drive. Martha stood in the center of the silver granite floor. The violet light was fading into a deep evening blue. The bell was still vibrating in the air. She reached up and touched the silver locket. The hinge was still broken, but she didn't feel the need to fix it. The tiny slip of paper inside was gone. She had burned it in the hearth that morning. She didn't need a promise written on paper anymore. She was standing on the truth. He was wrong about both. 1 year after the morning she arrived, Martha Sterling stood on the porch of the stone chapel. The estuary was a bright, shimmering blue under the April sun. The salt-resistant roses Silas had planted were heavy with white blossoms. The scent of the flowers moved through the open, arched doors. Martha was 64 years old. She was wearing a new linen shirt the color of the sky. She had bought it with the first interest payment from the London Trust. She did not look like a bookkeeper from a windowless office. She looked like the woman who owned the horizon. The chapel was no longer a ruin. It was a place where the people of Oakhaven came to sit in the violet light. Martha kept the doors open from dawn until dusk. She didn't charge admission. She didn't ask for donations. She simply made space for the silence. The oak benches glowed with the oil she applied once a month. The silver granite floor was polished to a soft sheen. There were no folders on the altar. There were only the brass candle holders Elias had found. She walked to the small wooden peg by the door. The silver locket hung there on a new, sturdy chain. She had taken it to a jeweler in the next town. The hinge was fixed. The metal was polished. It no longer rattled when the wind caught it. She didn't wear it anymore. She didn't need a reminder of a promise kept or broken. She liked the way it caught the light by the threshold. It was a part of the house now. She looked out toward the marsh. She thought about Arthur Sterling. She thought about the man who had hidden a box in a cellar 30 years ago. "I'm using the interest to fix the bell tower roof next month, Arthur," she said. Her voice was steady. It was a report to a partner who finally respected her work. "The ledger is balanced," she whispered. She felt a soft breeze move the hair from her forehead. It felt like a nod. The sun began to set behind the far ridge of the marsh. The water of the estuary turned a deep, bruised purple. Martha Sterling, 64 years old, watched a white heron land in the tall reeds near her fence. She did not reach for a ledger. She did not check her watch to see if Richard would be home for dinner. She simply watched the bird until it disappeared into the deepening shadows. The town of Oakhaven was quiet. The lights in the houses across the water began to blink on one by one. The people in those houses knew her name now. They knew her as the woman who had saved the stone chapel from the vines. They did not know her as the silent bookkeeper in the back of a glass tower. That version of Martha had vanished into the salt air months ago. She felt the silver locket hanging by the door. It was a small, bright point of light in the dimming hallway. It didn't represent a debt anymore. It was just a piece of silver. It was a piece of history that she had reclaimed with her own hard hands. She stepped inside and closed the heavy oak door. The click of the latch was soft and certain. The room was warm and smelled of roses and wood smoke. She was 64 years old, and she was finally home. Martha's journey proves that the most valuable thing we own is the courage to see the truth. Loyalty to another person is a gift, but loyalty to yourself is a requirement for survival. When the numbers of your life no longer add up, you have the right to find a new equation. You have the right to stop being the shadow so that someone else can shine. Martha didn't find a treasure because she was lucky. She found a treasure because she refused to believe she was worthless. The stone didn't give her a new life. The stone simply held the truth until she was strong enough to claim it. If Martha's story moved you today, if you've ever felt like the invisible foundation of a house that no one bothered to name, if you've spent your years building a stage for someone else to stand on, if you've ever looked at your life and felt like a guest in your own home, this community is here for you. Leave one word in the comments describing the moment Martha realized the chapel belonged to her all along. Your words help others who are still sitting in the dark, waiting for a sign that they still matter. Because Martha's story proves something that is always true. Your value is not determined by the person who failed to see it. The property of your soul cannot be stolen by someone who never understood its depth. Share this with someone who needs to remember that they are the architect of their own future. Send it to a friend who is standing at their own crossroads, wondering if it is too late to start over. It is never too late to pick up the key. It is never too late to ring the bell, because together we prove that dreams don't age.